The history of architecture in New York, a city written in stone and steel. Imagine standing on the edge of Manhattan. Before the skyscrapers existed, there are no towers piercing the clouds, no Times Square glowing through the night, no Empire State Building rising above the streets. Instead, there is water, forest, rocky ground, and the sound of wind moving through trees. A small settlement sits near the southern tip of the island, where ships arrive from across the Atlantic. This is the beginning of the architectural story of New York. Today, New York is famous for its skyline, but its architecture did not appear suddenly. Every building tells part of a much larger story, a story about immigration, wealth, technology, ambition, crisis, and the constant desire to build something higher and more impressive than what came before. New York's architecture is, in many ways, a portrait of the city itself. Chapter 1. Before the skyline. The early 17th century, European settlers arrived in the region that would eventually become New York City. The Dutch established New Amsterdam on the southern end of Manhattan. It was a trading settlement rather than the enormous metropolis we know today. The architecture was practical. Wooden houses stood beside narrow streets. Warehouses and commercial buildings appeared near the waterfront because trade was the heart of the settlement. Buildings were influenced by Dutch traditions, but they also had to respond to the local environment. The city was small enough that people could walk from one end to another without imagining that. Centuries later, millions of people would live and work there. Then history changed the name. In 1664, the English took control of the settlement and renamed it New York. The buildings did not immediately transform, but the political change began a new chapter. New York slowly developed into an important colonial port. Architecture followed commerce. As merchants became wealthier, houses became larger. Churches, markets, warehouses, and public buildings began to give the growing settlement a more permanent identity, yet fire remained a constant danger. Much of early New York was constructed from wood, and crowded streets made disasters difficult to control. The city learned one of architecture's oldest lessons: a building is never only about beauty. It must also survive the conditions around it. Chapter 2. A growing city. By the 18th century, New York had become an important colonial city. Its population was growing, and its streets were becoming busier. Architecture began to communicate status. A wealthy merchant's house could tell the neighborhood that its owner had succeeded. A church could dominate the surrounding streets and represent the power of a religious community. Government buildings could express political authority. But New York was still relatively modest compared with the city that would eventually emerge. The American Revolution brought enormous disruption. Buildings and neighborhoods suffered during the conflict, and the city's future was uncertain. After independence, however, New York entered a period of rapid growth. The young United States needed commercial centers, and New York was perfectly positioned to become one. Its natural harbor connected the city to international trade, while expanding transportation networks connected it to the rest of the country. The city began to stretch northward. Manhattan's future was being planned even before most of its famous buildings existed. Chapter 3. The grid changes. Everything. One of the most important moments in New York's architectural history did not involve a famous building. It involved lines. In 1811, the Commissioner's plan introduced a grid of streets and avenues across much of Manhattan. Instead of allowing the city to grow randomly, planners imposed an enormous geometric order on the island. At first, the idea seemed almost too simple: straight streets, long avenues, rectangular blocks. But that grid would shape New York for generations. The grid made land easier to divide and develop. As Manhattan's population increased, buildings could be constructed on standardized blocks. Property could be bought, sold, divided, and redeveloped with remarkable efficiency. The result was not a city of isolated monuments. It became a city of continuous streets. That distinction is important. In many older European cities, architecture often developed around irregular medieval streets and historic squares. New York developed differently. Its architecture became closely connected to the street grid. Buildings stood shoulder to shoulder. the city began to look like an enormous wall of architecture. Chapter 4. Brownstone, New York. Walk through parts of 19th century Manhattan today and you can still see one of the city's most recognizable architectural forms, the brownstone. During the 19th century, row houses became increasingly common. Their repeated facades created long, elegant streetscapes. Brownstone, a type of sandstone, became particularly fashionable. Imagine walking down one of these streets in the 19th century. A horse-drawn carriage passes in front of you. A family stands on the steps of a narrow townhouse. Iron railings frame basement entrances. Tall windows allow light into rooms above the street. Every house resembles its neighbor, but small differences reveal the wealth and personality of the people who live inside. This was a city becoming urban in the modern sense. The architecture reflected a new middle and upper class. Homes were no longer isolated country residences. They were part of an increasingly dense urban environment. At the same time, New York's population was exploding. Immigrants arrived from Ireland, Germany, Italy, Eastern Europe, and many other parts of the world. They brought languages, religions, traditions, and architectural influences with them. The city became a mixture of cultures, and its buildings began to show it. Chapter 5. Immigration builds a New York. One of the greatest mistakes people can make when looking at New York architecture is to think only about famous buildings. The city's true architectural history is also found in ordinary apartments, tenements, shops, synagogues, churches, restaurants, factories, and neighborhood streets. During the 19th century, enormous numbers of immigrants arrived in New York. Many lived in crowded tenement buildings. These buildings were often designed to fit as many people as possible into limited urban space. Their architecture reflected the harsh economic realities of the growing city. In neighborhoods such as the Lower East Side, entire families could occupy small apartments. Buildings stood tightly packed together, and sunlight and fresh air were often limited. The architecture revealed inequality. At the same time, immigrant communities transformed their neighborhoods. Religious buildings appeared. Businesses opened. New architectural traditions mixed with existing American styles. A single street could contain a church, a synagogue, a grocery store, a garment workshop, and apartment buildings occupied by families from different countries. New York was becoming a city of immigrants, and architecture became one of the physical records of that transformation. Chapter 6. The Age of Iron and Glass. The second half of the 19th century, technology began changing what architects could build. Iron became increasingly important. The traditional masonry building had serious limitations. Stone and brick walls had to carry enormous amounts of weight. As buildings became taller, their walls had to become thicker. Iron offered a new possibility. Structural frames could carry loads more efficiently. Large windows could bring more light into buildings. New construction methods allowed architects and engineers to experiment with height. The city began to move upward. Department stores, offices, hotels, railway stations, and commercial buildings became increasingly ambitious. Then came another revolution. The elevator. Before elevators became practical, climbing many floors was exhausting. A tall building without an elevator was not particularly useful to most people, but elevators changed the equation. Suddenly, the upper floors of buildings could become valuable. Height became economically attractive. The seeds of the skyscraper had been planted. Chapter 7. The birth of the skyscraper. The late 19th century, New York was ready for a new kind of architecture. The skyscraper was not simply a taller building. It was a new urban idea. Land in central Manhattan was valuable. Businesses wanted locations near transportation, finance, commerce, and other companies. Building upward offered a solution. Architects, engineers, investors, and construction workers collaborated to create buildings that had previously seemed impossible. Steel frames replaced many of the structural limitations of traditional masonry construction. The skyline began to change. For centuries, the tallest structures in cities had often been religious buildings, cathedrals, and church towers. In New York, commercial buildings began challenging that tradition. The tallest building in the city could now be an office building. That was more than an engineering achievement. It was a cultural statement. New York was announcing that commerce, technology, and modern capitalism had become powerful forces in urban life. Chapter 8. The Woolworth Building and the Vertical City. In 1913, the Woolworth Building opened and immediately became one of the most spectacular structures in the world. Its Gothic-inspired design made it look almost like a medieval cathedral transformed into a skyscraper. That was appropriate. The building seemed to combine two worlds: the historical tradition of monumental architecture and the modern ambition of American business. Its tower rose dramatically above Lower Manhattan. People looked upward. The city had entered the vertical age. Skyscrapers were no longer strange experiments. They were becoming part of New York's identity. The skyline became a kind of competition. Developers wanted taller buildings. Architects wanted more dramatic forms. Businesses wanted to occupy prestigious towers. The race toward the clouds had begun. Chapter 9. The Roaring Twenties and Art Deco. New York entered the 1920s. The city was wealthy, energetic, crowded, and ambitious. Jazz-filled nightclubs. Automobiles moved through streets. Movies became a major industry. Advertising transformed public spaces. Architecture changed with the mood. Art Deco arrived with geometric patterns, rich materials, stylized ornament, and a fascination with machines and modern life. The skyscraper became a symbol of the modern age. New York's skyline began to resemble a collection of enormous sculptures. Buildings were no longer simply tall rectangular boxes. They had setbacks, crowns, decorative details, and carefully designed silhouettes. The Chrysler Building became one of the great expressions of this era. Its stainless steel crown seemed to shine above Manhattan. The building's decorations celebrated automobiles, machines, and industrial progress. It was architecture designed to impress. And New York loved impressive things. Chapter 10. The Empire State Building. Then came a building that would become almost synonymous with New York itself. The Empire State Building rose during the early years of the Great Depression. Its construction was remarkably rapid. Thousands of workers participated in the project, working high above the streets. Imagine the construction site. Steel workers move across narrow beams. Riveters send sparks through the air. Cranes lift enormous pieces of metal. Below them, Manhattan continues moving cars, pedestrians, trains, businesses, and crowds. Piece by piece, the tower climbs. When the building opened in 1931, it became the tallest building in the world. Its height was extraordinary, but its cultural importance became even greater. The Empire State Building appeared in photographs, films, postcards, advertisements, and stories. It became a visual shorthand for New York. When people imagined the city, they began imagining the tower. Architecture had become mythology. Chapter 11. The Depression and the Changing City. Great Depression transformed New York. Economic hardship slowed construction. Many ambitious projects were abandoned or postponed, yet architecture continued to evolve. The city was forced to confront questions about housing, poverty, public infrastructure, and urban planning. Architecture was no longer simply about making buildings impressive. It was increasingly about making the city functional. Public housing, bridges, transportation systems, schools, and public buildings became important parts of the urban landscape. New York's architecture was becoming increasingly connected to government and social policy. The city was not just building upward. It was trying to solve the problems created by its own growth. Chapter 12. Modernism arrives. After World War II, another architectural revolution began. Modernist architects rejected much of the decorative language of earlier architecture. Instead of elaborate ornament, they emphasized clean lines, simple forms, glass, steel, and functional design. The modern office tower emerged. One of the most influential examples was the Seagram Building, completed in 1958. Its dark glass and bronze structure represented a very different idea of the skyscraper. It was elegant rather than theatrical. The building suggested that modern architecture did not need elaborate decoration to express power. The skyscraper could be simple, and simplicity could become luxurious. Chapter 13. A City of Contrast. B. The middle of the 20th century, New York had developed a fascinating architectural contradiction. Historic brownstones existed beside glass towers. 19th-century churches stood near modern office buildings. Old tenements survived while entire neighborhoods were being transformed. This mixture became one of New York's greatest visual strengths. The city never completely erased its past. Instead, new architecture was repeatedly placed on top of older architecture. Sometimes this happened beautifully, sometimes it created conflict. Urban renewal projects during the 20th century destroyed historic buildings and neighborhoods. Some people believed old structures represented progress that should be removed. Others argued that destroying them meant destroying the city's memory. These debates helped create the modern preservation movement. New Yorkers began asking an important question: how much of the past should a modern city keep? Chapter 14. Jane Jacobs and the Human Street. In the mid-20th century, writer and activist Jane Jacobs challenged the way many planners thought about cities. She believed successful urban neighborhoods depended on more than large buildings and highways. They needed people, they needed sidewalks, shops, parks, mixed uses, neighbors, pedestrians, and activity throughout the day. Her ideas became deeply influential in debates about New York's future. The argument was simple but powerful. A city should not be designed only for cars or large-scale development. It should also be designed for human beings. This helped change how people viewed New York's older neighborhoods. A narrow street could be valuable. A small shop could matter. An old building could contribute to the character of a neighborhood. Architecture was not merely the object. The relationship between buildings and people was equally important. Chapter 15. The World Trade Center. In the 1970s, New York's skyline changed again. The World Trade Center's twin towers rose dramatically over Lower Manhattan. They represented another version of modernity: large-scale commerce, international trade, engineering power, and economic ambition. The towers were enormous. From the ground, they seemed to continue upward without end. For decades, they became part of the city's visual identity, but on September 11, 2001, the towers were destroyed in a terrorist attack. The architectural history of New York suddenly became inseparable from memory and loss. The empty space left behind became one of the most emotionally significant places in the city. Rebuilding it required more than engineering. It required answering difficult questions about remembrance, security, public space, and the future. Chapter 16. Rebuilding Ground Zero. Redevelopment of the World Trade Center site became one of the most complicated architectural projects in modern New York. The new World Trade Center complex introduced new towers, transportation infrastructure, memorial spaces, and public areas. One World Trade Center eventually rose above Lower Manhattan. Its glass facade reflected the sky, but unlike the skyscrapers of the early 20th century, its meaning was shaped by what had happened before. It was not simply a tower. It was a statement of recovery. New York had lost an important part of its skyline, but it had not lost its desire to build. Chapter 17. The New Architecture of New York. Walk through New York today and you will see a city still changing. Glass residential towers rise above older neighborhoods. Historic warehouses become offices and restaurants. Former industrial districts become expensive residential areas. Architecture follows economic change. Neighborhoods such as Soho and the Meatpacking District demonstrate how old industrial structures can acquire new lives. Former factories and warehouses can become galleries, stores, apartments, and creative spaces. Meanwhile, new suburban residential buildings have pushed the limits of height once again. The modern New York skyscraper can be extraordinarily thin. Engineering has become almost invisible. A tower may appear to float above the street. supported by technologies that are difficult to see from the sidewalk. Yet the basic story remains familiar. New York still builds upward because land is valuable and ambition is enormous. Chapter 18. Architecture as a record of immigration. Perhaps the most beautiful thing about New York's architecture is that it does not belong to a single culture. The city has been shaped by people from around the world: Italian churches, Jewish synagogues, African American cultural institutions, Chinese commercial streets, Greek Orthodox churches, Caribbean neighborhoods, and countless other cultural spaces have contributed to the city's architectural identity. Every immigrant group arrived with memories of another place. Then those memories were adapted to New York. A building could preserve a tradition while responding to a completely new environment. That is why New York architecture feels so diverse. The city did not simply import architectural traditions. It mixed them. It transformed them. It created something new. Chapter 19. The skyline as a story. Look at the New York skyline carefully and you can almost read its history. The older towers tell stories of 19th century ambition. Art Deco skyscrapers reveal the confidence of the 1920s and 1930s. Modernist towers represent the post-war belief in efficiency and technology. Glass residential towers reveal the enormous economic value of Manhattan real estate in the 21st century. Each generation built according to its own dreams, and each generation believed, in some way, that its buildings represented the future. That is why New York's skyline never feels finished. A completed building is never really the end of the story. Another project is already being imagined somewhere. Another architect is drawing lines. Another engineer is calculating loads. Another developer is looking at a piece of land and asking the same question New Yorkers have asked for generations. What can we build here? Chapter 20. The future of New York architecture. Future of New York architecture will probably be shaped by challenges that earlier generations could barely imagine. Climate change is forcing architects to think about flooding, heat, storms, energy consumption, and resilient infrastructure. Sustainability is becoming increasingly important. Buildings must consume less energy. Public spaces must become more adaptable. Waterfront areas must be protected while remaining accessible. Technology is also changing. Architecture. Digital design allows architects to create forms that would have been extremely difficult to imagine decades ago. Advanced engineering makes taller and lighter buildings possible, but the biggest challenge may not be technological. It may be human. New York must continue to answer difficult questions about housing affordability, historic preservation, density, public space, and inequality. A beautiful skyline does not automatically create a successful city. The real measure of architecture is how people experience the spaces between and inside the buildings. Conclusion. A city that never stops building. New York's architectural history is not really a history of buildings. It is a history of people. It begins with a small settlement near the water and grows into one of the world's great cities. It passes through wooden colonial houses, brownstone streets, crowded tenements, iron-framed commercial buildings, monumental skyscrapers, Art Deco masterpieces, modern glass towers, and experimental contemporary structures. Each era leaves something behind. The Dutch left the foundations of an urban settlement. The 19th century left neighborhoods of row houses, churches, and tenements. Industrialization created the conditions for the skyscraper. The early 20th century transformed the skyline into a symbol of ambition. Modernism changed the language of architecture. The preservation movement taught the city to value its past, and the 21st century continues to ask what a global city should look like. Perhaps that is the most remarkable thing about New York. It never truly finishes. A historic building may stand for a century, while a new tower rises beside it. A street that once served factories may become a neighborhood of apartments and restaurants. A forgotten warehouse may become a cultural center. An old church may stand beneath the shadow of a glass skyscraper. past and future exist together. That is why walking through New York can feel like walking through several centuries at once. The city is not a museum. It is a living architectural experiment. Its buildings are arguments about what the city was, what it became, and what it hopes to be, and above all of them is the skyline, a constantly changing collection of stone, brick, iron, steel, and glass. At sunrise, the towers catch the first light. At sunset, their windows turn gold. At night, thousands of lights appear, one after another, until the city seems to become a constellation. On the ground, the architecture of New York has always been about reaching upward, but perhaps its greatest achievement is not simply that it reached the sky. It is that, through centuries of change, New York continued to build a physical record of human ambition. Every street has a memory, every neighborhood has a story, every tower has a dream, and the city keeps writing its history in stone, in steel, and in glass.